I want to talk about open access to knowledge. I want to talk about the spirit of école normale supérieure. The idea in the French Revolution, as I understand it, was that all of France, as part of the French Revolution, would have an education system, a national education system. It would have and give every child a right, as part of the rights of man, a right to an education. And today, the open access movement is about that right, the right of every child, every adult, to all of education. And so what started in the French Revolution, what didn't go always so well in the French Revolution, but what resulted in this institution is something that some of us are trying to continue. Marie has been working tirelessly on behalf of open access, and I want to add a few aspects to it. My own work in open access goes back to 1998. I was no longer a school teacher. I did it so badly that they made me a teacher of teachers. This is how we do things in Canada. They took me out of the classroom and they put me in front of teachers. I shared research with those teachers that talked about how important learning was and different ways of learning. And then when they graduated, I could not share that research with them any longer because they no longer belonged to the library. I worked with the local newspaper to help promote education. And I realized that I could not share any of the research in the newspaper with the public because of the restrictions. And at that point in 1998, I changed my direction from working with teachers to working with editors and with publishers and with libraries on what I think of as the big public education movement. And that is, this could be the largest increase in public education since the French Revolution. That's a little bit exaggerated and dramatic, but it would be because we would be opening the doors of every university, every laboratory, every university library to all of the public. They won't go and read every day. I don't expect them to be sitting on the buses looking at my articles or Marie's articles or any of your articles, but they only need to look once. There just has to be one indication, one sign. In my case, when a child is in school, they might be interested in my research on literacy. When they're stuck on which dictionary to buy, they might look at my work on the Oxford English Dictionary and the downside and the upside of that. So this idea that we're interested in public education, that we're interested in a less exclusive, and I understand that the normale is not normale, it is superior, and so this is a very exclusive institution and very difficult to get into, but that when you get into it, you have an obligation to the French people. You have a debt to the French people, and I think the world. And again, open access is about that. So let me give you an update on what we mean and where open access is today. You may already know all of this, but let me at least share some of it. When we say open access, when I say open access, we're referring to the published literature. That is the research and scholarship, primarily in journals. So all of the academic journals that are peer-reviewed, that publish the latest research, and I'll talk about some examples of that. Books as well, monographs as well, but it's been a little slow with monographs. The journals have all gone online. The journals are all available electronically. Books, not so much. My library at Stanford just passed the 1 million mark in the number of electronic books it has. It has 6 million in print. So that's just starting. But let me focus on journals, and in particular on academic and scholarly journals that are very, very expensive and that are, in a sense, keeping books from being published because they're using up so much of the money involved in scholarly communication. So open access means that anyone who happens upon an article can read it. They do not need a password. They do not need to belong to a library. There's no security like the security gate that I came through very easily. I just walked. I followed somebody in. It's not very strict security. But at any rate, the openness is easy to establish with open access. with a number of different ways, but we have many journals now that are open access, that are free to read. Over 10,000 journals are indexed in a directory of open access journals, but there are probably 30,000 journals, maybe even 40,000 journals that are not, that you need to belong to a library or that you need thousands of dollars to subscribe to. The journals can be as expensive as $30,000. Now, the American dollar is doing very well right now, so you can say to yourself, 29,000 euros would be $30,000. So this huge expense of these journals, these 20 to 30,000 journals, against these other journals that are free to readers. And this is a strange state. Let me give you a little bit more on it. One of the probably most prestigious of the open journals, because some people think that open journals, if it's free, it can't be very good. So I always have to give an example, and the best example is PLOS. This stands for Public Library of Science. PLOS Biology, in 2 years, was able to establish itself as the highest cited, that is the most prestigious journal in biology, PLOS Biology. And it did so very deliberately. It had a Nobel Prize winner as an editor. It was very selective in its papers. And it even charged authors what's called an article processing charge in order to have a very good editor and in order to have a very professional publication. So PLOS has established a new model for open access. The PLOS Biology is not in print. PLOS Biology is free for everyone in the world to read, and PLOS Biology is cited more than any other journal in biology. Another example of an open access journal is PLOS, Public Library of Science, One. Very simple, Very simple journal title, but it's a new kind of journal. It is a mega journal. Last year, PLOS One published 30,000 articles. And this kind of model changes how knowledge is shared. Every article was peer-reviewed, but no articles, if they passed the peer review, were kept from publication. Every article was published the moment it was ready, 3 or 4 or 5 a day. And the principle was that if the article passes the peer review, if the science is competent, then the public should have it. It shouldn't be kept out because the editors think it's not as important as this article, and the author's not as distinguished as some of my colleagues here. It was published. They had a 70% acceptance rate, which is very, very high for the sciences. They still had an impact factor. They still had prestige, not as high as PLOS Biology, but they still established an impact factor of, if you know the impact factors, of less than 4. But still on the scale. And so this idea that a new model is coming around open science is where my work comes in and what I'm concerned about. Now the commercial publishers, remember the $30,000 journal? This is an Elsevier journal. Elsevier is a very distinguished, century-old publisher of about 3,000 journals. It's the largest publisher, period, of journals. And has made a lot of money, a $30,000 journal. It creates a lot of money. Even Elsevier has seen the writing on the wall, on the screen, and has decided to start publishing open access journals. And the reason that Elsevier is switching is because they've discovered that article processing charges are just as good as subscription charges. And they are charging Cell, do you know this journal, very distinguished journal in biology, not as distinguished as PLOS Biology, but very distinguished and probably very close to PLOS Biology, charges the authors $5,000 to be published. And the authors agree to publish for $5,000 because they want their work open, because they want their work in Cell, and they have a choice if they want to make it open, actually. But Elsevier is now switching its model slowly to open access, because if it gets the subscriptions turned into the article processing charges, Elsevier can make just as much money, can increase the cost each year as it has with subscriptions, and everyone can be happy. I'm not happy about this. This is like a bad dream. When I wanted open access, it hadn't occurred to me, and this often happens. The French Revolution is a very good example of this. When Rousseau and others Diderot, all dreamed of a French Revolution, they thought that it would be messy on the streets. They thought there would be wonderful institutions like this one, but they did not foresee the terror. They did not foresee the revolution going bad. And so I don't feel myself to be Voltaire, but I do think that this was not expected. That we would get open access, only it would cost us $5,000 as an author to publish an article. Now, in biology, in Cell, you might have a grant that would pay for that. But in my field of education, no. If you are in the field of Simone Weil, in philosophy, no. Not $5,000 in your whole lifetime would you see that kind of grant. And Simone lived very modestly in that regard. So this idea that we're shifting to open access, and let me give you some other examples, means we need a new economic model. But what I want to say is that open access is going to happen. If Elsevier is moving to open access, you can believe it's going to happen. If the US government, if Barack Obama's White House has a policy for open access, all government agencies in the United States, where I now work, are required that any money they give must result in open access publications. Now, you can publish in an open access journal, or you can publish in a subscription journal, as long as you make your final draft public. Okay, so there are two ways. You can choose an open access journal like PLOS Biology, or you can go into Cell with $5,000 and have an open access article, or you can publish in a subscription journal and make that final copy, the draft, after it's been peer-reviewed, open access. So we have with the US government, we have with the commercial publishers, we have with PLOS and other publishers, we have with the Public Knowledge Project. Let me just briefly give you a sense of what we do. So the Public Knowledge Project, which I started in 1998, makes software for the use of journals, so they can publish online. Our argument was, if we made the software free, then you will want to make the journal free. Some aren't so sure. I thought it would work when we built the software, first of all. It hasn't worked completely. I gave you a free software. You owe me. No, doesn't work like that. I give them the free software. They say, does it come in blue? Could it be faster? Why did you put the button on the right? The button always goes on the left. And so we've been doing that for moving the button from the left. And you know, as soon as you put it on the left, other people say, where did you get that idea? Buttons always, anyway. So we've been building this software and giving it away. It is open source software. And open source software is part of the same open movement that open access is part of. Google, IBM, others are beginning to create and release open source software. So the opening in software has been much more successful than the opening of the knowledge. And which is weird because software is such a good business, you would think that it would be closed. But in fact, the open source software movement is at the core, in fact, of Google's work. And if IBM is going that way, then it's got to be happening. So we created open source software for journals. They can download it and use it for free. It is available, yes, in French. I'm a Canadian. Of course, it has to be for Quebec. But it is available in Portuguese and Spanish. It is available in Vietnamese and Russian. And we have 8,000 journals around the world using our software. That's 8,000 journals that haven't gone to Elsevier or Taylor and Francis or other commercial publishers. 8,000 journals, that are open access, because it's open, they can do what they want, you know, this open concept. So some journals are using our software and charging. And what can we say? We can say, it's open. I'm disappointed, tear in my eye. I'm upset, but it's open. You do what you want. So we're on its way to 90%, about 88% are open. Half of these journals are in the developing world, and this has been an important aspect of open access, because open access means an open world, a global, as it were, exchange of knowledge. Excuse me. And that sense then that we can begin to create a more equitable world is part of this open aspect. So we have, for example, African Journals Online is a collection of almost 500, about 480 journals in Africa that use our software to make their work available on Google Scholar. And we work very closely with Google Scholar. It is commercial, but it is changing the world in that sense. I have a son who works at Google, so I need to kind of disclose my conflicts of interest and be honest with you and open, because openness, you know, this is my game. So this idea then that we could create an open knowledge exchange is a very important one. The journals that come from the global south have been ignored. Latin America has been open since the very beginning of the internet. So we think it's around 90% of Latin American literature is open access. Brazil is leading. They're using our software, almost 2,000 journals. So there is an uneven revolution. Of those 8,000 journals, very, very few are charging article processing charges. So the author doesn't pay $5,000. No, the author doesn't pay and the reader doesn't pay. And they both, all of these journals come up in Google Scholar. So we imagine that it's leveling the playing field, and that the ability to share and exchange knowledge, is improving. So that's all preliminary to what I really want to talk about tonight. And what I really want to talk about is the intellectual property arguments around this. Because one of the things that I couldn't answer, one of the questions that bothered me, was why should this knowledge be free? No other knowledge is free. The books, the novels, I keep referring to novels, you pay for them. The authors live off them. In Canada, we're very proud of Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro and other authors. We're very fond of Neil Young and Leonard Cohen, and all of them deserve every cent they make. I would never ask Leonard Cohen, I don't get many opportunities, but I would never ask Leonard Cohen, if I had an opportunity, to make his work free. But I want to make an argument about what I'm calling the intellectual properties of learning. That what goes on in the École Normale is a different kind of intellectual property. And I want to convince you on a historical basis, I want to convince you on a theoretical basis, that learning is a different kind of intellectual property and needs to be already is recognized in the courts and in French law and Canadian law and American law as a different kind, but in a way that has been lost, in a way that has been obscured, in a way that has been exploited by many publishers and many scholarly societies and many nonprofits included among those societies. Most of them are. So let me tell you what I want to argue, or at least make a very brief case. This book is very long, and I will not keep you here all night, but I will give you just a brief overview. We would call this an infomercial. Do you know this term, infomercial? Where they try to sell things after midnight on television, and they give you information, but they're really trying to sell you things. This is what I'm doing, in a sense. So what I want to convince you of is that learning is at the origins of the concept of intellectual property. That we have no idea about intellectual property that has not come from the work of scholars and researchers, historically. The second thing that I've already said is that intellectual property associated with learning is distinct from all other forms of commercial, even non-profit kinds of intellectual property. And so those two differences that I want to point out to you. One about the origins and one about the sense in which it operates on a different basis, is a historical and theoretical argument. And let me do, today there was a lecture on Spinoza, on Baruch Spinoza. Did you see the posters? Marie explained to me that if Spinoza was not so big, my posters would have been on the front of École Normale. That Spinoza, Willinsky, I mean, we're both Jewish, but it's not the same. But the same year that Spinoza was born, in 1632, John Locke was born. And John Locke has a theory of property that is hugely influential, probably the most well-known theory of property. And in the country I now teach in America, he was not so big in Canada, but in America, John Locke is the philosopher of America. And the importance of private property in America is paramount, in intellectual property especially, and in Silicon Valley where I teach especially. But Locke provided that theory of property, and it was part of a natural right theory. Today's talk on Spinoza, if you look at the posters, which I did, and looking for my name, and the talk on Spinoza was about natural right. And the 17th century was very much filled with the sense that there was a natural right that needed to be discovered, and that if we could bring law into a realm of natural right, whether you believed it was God-given or you believed it was a gift of reason, this is the Enlightenment, then we would achieve a supreme state, an ideal state. And Locke gave a natural law or natural right theory of property. And what's interesting about it is that it starts with the notion that the world was given to us in common. There is no natural gift of property, except one slight exception he makes. But he starts with the premise that the world, whether you believe in reason, he says, or revelation, the world is given in common. And what's important about that is that property needs to be justified. Because without that justification, we hold everything in common. And that common state is where open access begins to start. And what I'm going to argue is that what is common about learning needs to be maintained, and that the property distinctions that Locke allows for are part of a commercial, private enterprise, and that what learning is about is not private. What learning is about is sharing. And the value of learning and the value of your learning is helping others to learn. And so the pleasure of not having PowerPoint slides this evening, the pleasure of speaking to you directly, is the ability to look into your eyes and not have you looking up at the screen over my shoulder. Some of you are still a little nervous, thinking there'll be slides in a moment. It is the ability for me to see in your eyes whether there is this learning going on. And so this idea then of Locke, he talks about two bases for property. The first one is we have a property in ourselves. All right? And for him, this is a critical human right, the basis of democracy, and the sanctity of property, that each of us has a property in ourselves. Very important principle for feminism. In the United States in the 70s, there was a women's health collective, and their motto was, "Our bodies, ourselves," which was to say, our bodies do not belong to the doctors, our husbands, our lovers. Our bodies are ourselves. And a very Lockean principle. Not that Locke was a feminist, or that Locke was particularly progressive in some of these ways, but that he hit upon this principle. The second thing Locke said is that labor justifies property. That if you work on something, that you have a right to it, whether it's picking the nuts off the trees outside here in the école, or whether it is harvesting the apples, that labor. And this is important because we have in scholarship a similar sense, but with a difference I want to point out. The similar sense is that there is no scholarship without labor. Where is the work? And we call it our work. And what I'm working on right now. And the second is the self-possession. Where are you in the scholarship? Where is your work? So as a graduate student, you always need to establish where your work is, your contribution. And those are very Lockean principles. But what Locke also says is that the property is justified if it increases the common stock. It has to contribute to the whole. So the apples in the orchard, I can only justify putting a fence up, keeping the children out of the apple orchards. Augustine has a very famous story about pears, I think it is, where he as a boy went and stole the pears for no other reason than just the thrill of stealing the pears, and this is one of his great sins. He had others, he didn't talk about them so much. He felt badly about stealing the pears, and Augustine took the pears and he actually threw them away afterwards. He felt kind of guilty about it. And the reason we put up the fence is because if everybody stole the pears, we would have a pear shortage, and you do wonderful things with pears in the French pastries. The price of pears would go up. Everybody would lose. There would be a pear shortage. And I don't blame Augustine for this. He was a saint. But the example is that we can close off the pear orchard in order to improve the common stock, which is to say, cheapen the cost of pears. And you would have no desserts here, no pastries without those pears. So this idea that we can think about property intellectually, it calls for a slight transformation. What is the difference? And the difference is that if we close off our orchard of intellectual property, we do not increase the common stock. We do not, as it were, make it more widely available, reduce the price of it. What we do when we close it off is we only increase the price, that the real value of intellectual property is in the sharing. And what I want to argue is that historically, that access to intellectual property is in fact a different kind of access. So in French, le droit d'auteur, the right of the author, is your word for copyright. And so normally when we translate French into English, you can almost see the kind of resonance for methodology or other terms, translation. But with copyright, you have this very strange term that doesn't exist. In English, we do not have the right of the author as an expression. What I want to argue with you is the right of the author, le droit d'auteur, is a double right. So the author has a right to their own work, and an author has a right to your work and your work. Because I cannot work as a scholar unless I have a right to everyone's work. And my work as a scholar, and I want to put my name on it, doesn't stand unless everyone has a right to it. This was Isaac Newton's big problem. Isaac Newton did not want to share his work. He was very, we would say, retentive of his work. And for that, but he did release it. He published only one article in his life. Many of you may have beat Isaac Newton already. He published a few books that were quite phenomenal. But articles he was very reluctant to share. But he knew that if he did not share his work, it would not be recognized, it would not be validated, it would not stand. And so the epistemological principle of access is that everyone needs to have that access if we're going to make a claim of knowledge. And the fact that we exclude so many from that knowledge with very expensive subscriptions, with restricted access to the library, all of those restrictions reduce the claim of that knowledge. And so though Descartes was able to look into his own soul and was able to establish a foundation for knowledge, almost everyone who came after Descartes, and certainly all of the very prestigious names that attended at this institution, from Foucault to Derrida, all of them felt that that was a misapprehension, that we cannot establish within ourselves. Wittgenstein is a very good example as well in terms of private languages. We cannot establish knowledge within ourselves, that knowledge is constructed socially, but not to say that it is simply a simple agreement. There is reason, there is evidence, but there is still an element of construction for knowledge. So this idea that we need access to knowledge comes back to this very basic principle of the rights of the author. Now, for Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro and Neil Young and Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, no? All of these are famous Canadians. All of these Canadians have a right to claim money, to attend their concerts, and to buy their albums, their CDs, their streams. All of those rights are to be protected. But they don't base it on it's not based on the same grounds as scholarship. They have no footnotes. They have no citation. Well, they cite, Bob Dylan's in the background a little bit. But they have no direct citation. They do not need that access on the same basis. And so scholarship for me requires that level of access. So that's the Locke argument. The common stock for research only goes up, is only improved to the degree to which we have access. The library is the commons, the university library. In the library, everyone has equal access to every work. I don't know about École Normale, but at Stanford, if an undergraduate student, a 18-year-old student, wants the book that I am working on and using, I have to give it up. 1 week I have to get that book to the student as quickly as I can. Do you have that? Is the students able to recall the books in the library here? From a professor? No? Yes? So we treat the commons as equal territory. Everyone in the library has equal access to everything in the library. And that is the ideal Lockean commons. It doesn't work with cars. It doesn't work with bicycles. It doesn't work with Neil Young's music or Alice Munro's stories. It works only in this world of scholarship. So that was the theory of John Locke. Let me give you some examples. When I got to that theory, I was very excited. The world's given in common. We can increase the common stock. I thought I had the answer, but it occurred to me that if I was going to explain to people open access and I said it was about Locke, they would say to me that's only a theory. Now, École Normale, a theory is everything. To the publisher Elsevier, a theory is nothing. They want the evidence, they want the capital, they want the revenue, they want the proof. So I had to find a historical example of where did the commons exist. The Garden of Eden might have been a starting point, but it didn't work out very well in the Garden of Eden. The tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, you know this story. So where I went back to in terms of the Western tradition was monasticism, the monasteries. A great tradition in Paris. We talked about the monasteries and the convents that didn't go so well after a while, but this was much later. The early monasteries, in the early Middle Ages, after the collapse of Rome, even before the collapse of Rome, were outposts or oases of learning. And the property status in the monastery? No private property. So the monasteries had this very interesting world set apart. The noble gave the land to the monastery took that land and created a life for the monks and nuns on equal grounds, by the way, men and women in the early Middle Ages. Double monasteries, sometimes run by women. Not men and women still separate, but on the monastic grounds. And they created a network of monasteries that would share this intellectual property. The interesting side is monasticism was not friendly to learning at first. That the rule of Benedict, the Benedictine monasteries, were suspicious of learning. Because learning is a source of pride, which is a sin. You may not know this experience in France of prideful learning. I come from Stanford University. This is the University of Prideful Learning. And as a Canadian, I found it very hard at first to kind of, you have to be upfront all the time with your pride. But actually, I do think the French have a bit of pride about learning. And I do think that the way that you honor the learned here, on every street sign, on the houses and memorials that you create. So the Benedictines said learning is suspicious for pride. It's suspicious for heresy and blasphemy. How dare you interpret the Word of God? Where do you get off saying that Christ meant this or that? That's hubris. That's pride. That's a source of sinfulness. And so the monasteries had to, over a period of time, find a place for learning. And among the English, we have the Venerable Bede, who said that his learning was nothing, only a service to others, and that he took no pride in his learning, only as it helped others to learn, to be pious, to be religious, to find and to look into the face of God. And the monasteries built up, as it were, a sense of learning around its contribution, around their humility. So we have many, many illuminated manuscripts with very, very few signatures, very, very few claims of authorship. We have beautiful illuminated manuscripts where we don't know who the illuminator was. And very often the records of women in monasticism are completely lost because of this humility. But at the same time, the monasteries built up a network of manuscripts in which none were owned and all were shared. One example I would give you is Hildegard of Bingen. This is Marie is a fan of, and a singer herself, and Hildegard was an amazing nun. It is a question of access for Hildegard, and access is the point here. Hildegard, at the age of 7 or 8, entered a monastery and was walled in. Not just enclosed in the monastery, but bricked in with a cousin, with a slight hole where things would come in and out. And she worked her way from that enclosure into the garden, the medicinal garden, and was the pharmacist, you might say, for the monastery. She composed music. She suffered migraine headaches. This is in the 12th century, 11th and 12th century. 11th century, I would say, now that I think about it. The 11th century. And out of her migraines, she created these beautiful illuminated cosmologies where she would see the position of God and Christ and herself recording it. And she would create then a philosophy in terms of the organization of bodies, from the divine to the secular. She would create medicines that are still available today, what we might call holistic medicine, homeopathy. Does that ring a bell? So she made many contributions, and in that contribution that she made, the monastery allowed her, as she became an abbess and took over and had the authority, to start venturing out and start sharing her knowledge. Her knowledge was considered to be so valuable, her music was considered to be so beautiful, that it would be a sin to keep it within the enclosure of the monastery. And where nuns suffered a much greater enclosure than the monks, Hildegard began to break that because her learning was seen as a gift. And its value was seen not in selling Benedictine wine or liqueur, B&B. Do you know this? Yes, the Benedictine. Not selling. In her case, she traveled the Rhine, lecturing, preaching like this, and giving out recipes for homeopathic medicines, and sharing her music, which was transcribed and which we still have many examples of today. And so this idea that the monasteries, which we think of as closed, but were in fact preserving knowledge and sharing it. If we think about the monasteries as supported by the state, or at least the nobility, the feudal system, how the money was given to the monastery as a way of bringing the world closer to God. The monasteries were separated from the world, but they produced an intellectual property. Now, why was it intellectual property? Because what the monks and nuns began to do around the 11th and 12th century was they began to see the value of identifying authors. They began to see the distinctions between St. Jerome and St. Augustine. You remember the pairs? He never forgave himself for those pairs. We can forgive. It's human to forgive, or maybe it's divine to forgive. But at any rate, they would begin to see that the discourse of authors, the ability to identify Augustine, was an ability to understand his work better. To tell St. Jerome apart from St. Augustine was a way to understand Catholic theology better. And the identity of the author was not an ownership issue, it was a learning issue. It was an understanding issue. And so the intellectual properties of Augustine's work had to do with guilt. Remember the guilt? And Jerome's work had to do with a lot of pride, a lot of detail on commas and translation. Augustine was a great translator. And so this idea that the monks began to become involved, and where they would make this kind of discovery is in the margins of the text. So the manuscripts would begin to accumulate a glossary and would point out that Bede's interpretation differed from Augustine's interpretation of the gospel, and that the intellectual properties of the gospel was actually the center of attention, and the authorship of those commentaries, not the authorship of the gospel, but even that. Bede was one who did work on the authorship of the gospel, that whether Matthew, Mark, and John were properly distinguished as authors. This whole idea created a sense in which the text itself had properties, had qualities. Now this is 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 centuries before intellectual property is invented. There's no word for it. There's commentary, and there is glossary, but there's no sense of it being intellectual property. But all of that commentary and glossary was focused on a sense of what are the properties of this text. Islam becomes a great example for access. What happens in the 12th century, 11th and 12th century, but in the 12th, mainly in the 12th century, is there is a discovery of Islamic learning. That Europe recaptures this Iberian Peninsula that was Islamic from about the 7th century. And in that recapture, they discover, in the interactions of Muslims and Jews and Christians, there is a wealth of Islamic learning that Western Europe knew nothing about. There is 1 or 2 works. Aristotle's Categories is available. Plato's Timaeus is available, but almost nothing else in Latin. Very, very few could speak. In fact, very, very, very few. A handful of people could write and translate in Greek. But Islam had translated it all. From Greek, from Syrian, from Persian, from Hindu, mathematics, all of the numbers, number systems that we now take for granted came from India through Islamic learning. And in the 11th and 12th century, the access that was created through this translation. And even though the Crusades are starting, even though the movement against Islam from the West is beginning in this period, the learned are saying, I don't want to wear any armor. I don't need a sword. I need someone who can translate Euclid. Because Euclid was only available in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in Greek. And to bring Euclid into Latin opened a world of access in terms of mathematics. And this idea then that Islamic learning, its entry in the translation movement in Toledo, in other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, we now think of as modern Spain, created a huge influx of texts. They would be translated into Latin. They would move north. No printing yet. This is still the 11th and 12th century. They would be copied by hand. And my argument is no Islamic learning, no universities. Because the same time that that literature, all of Aristotle, all of Plato, came north in this period of 2 centuries. Now today we would think that's nothing. We could have tweeted that. We could have had that through all of Europe in a matter of moments. But 2 centuries in this period is very fast. From one Aristotle and one Plato to the complete works. Well, we don't know if it's the complete works, but the complete extant works of Galen in medicine, of Euclid in math, of Plato and Aristotle in philosophy and in natural science, along with the Islamic scholars themselves, so that algebra and the algorithm is a gift from Al-Kindi and from other Islamic mathematicians, all came north. And my theory is that the monasteries could not handle this. They were still very apologetic about learning. It still had to be very carefully. The cathedral schools, Notre Dame, was a little bit more open. Abelard, we know Peter Abelard was a free spirit intellectually and perhaps other ways. And Abelard and others were beginning to share this learning, but nothing was ready for this huge influx of Islamic learning. And we needed a new institution. We needed people who were gathered in the marketplaces who had access to these and would sell their services, would say that I have read all of Aristotle. Nobody else in this community of Oxford or Paris knows Aristotle like I know it. And they would start charging fees, and they would start organizing into a guild. And those guilds became the first universities. And those guilds in Paris and in Oxford and Bologna, Padua, and other spots became these universities. And it was based on an access to knowledge. It was based on no sense of private, exclusive rights, but based on a very strong sense of the author's right as a scholar to these works and as a scholar to be known for the contribution to that work. So the right of the scholar is only established first by having access to a right to those works, and then secondly by establishing what they have contributed to having had access to this work. So a double right and a double point of access. The Bodleian Library is another chapter for me, another aspect of this. The Bodleian Library at Oxford is a public library. We're now into the 17th. Am I moving too fast? We did all the medieval period. Very quick student. You're in the normal. No, you're in the superior. You're not normal. Ce n'est pas normal. So the Bodleian Library in the 17th century becomes this huge public library. And Bodley contributes to this library in order to make it public. He is a graduate of Oxford, but he married into the sardine wealth. Do you know sardines? Not a very nice fish in some ways, but I've enjoyed a sandwich or two. He marries into this family. He establishes a lot of wealth. He gives it to build a library. The Harry Potter fans here, that all is shot in the Bodleian Library. This is a very Harry Potter kind of place. But the important principle for us is Bodley says we must create a public library where knowledge is preserved, and we must donate the books. There is no money at Oxford to buy books. And so Bodley says, don't worry. He gives the lumber to build the shelves, and then he looks and he sees, doesn't look so nice. Empty shelves as far as the eye can see. He convinced his wealthy friends to start donating books. He spoke to the publishers. We're now in the 17th century. We now have publishers in print. He had the publishers agree to give one copy, that's all, one copy of every book printed to the Bodleian Library. And this, for me, is the model. You take the commercial books and you take one of them out of the commercial setting and you put it into the public library, where it is preserved for all scholars. And so the library is a commons where there is no private property. In the Bodleian Library, you cannot take a book out of the library. That might seem unfair, but what does that guarantee? Every book is always there for every person. A student doesn't have to ask me for the book. In fact, in the Bodleian Library, when you take a book off the shelves, you have to put a little note in the shelf saying, I'm sitting at table 6 and I'm using that book. No, you can't put that. You can just only say, I'm sitting at table 6, but I would always add a note. And I'm using this book really in an important way. So just back off. Because when you go to the United States, you have to learn how to speak like this, back off. Okay? And they told me nobody in the library had ever said this before. Even this model, this example that Marie chose, this is a weight holding a book. The libraries had chained books. And you may think that that is against open access. But the chaining of the books in the library guaranteed what? Access to everybody. The book is, and they always chained the best edition, so that you always had guaranteed access. Now, the library wasn't open 24/7. We noticed here in the École Normale, not open very late. But that was in order for you to come to this talk. We closed the library, hoping more people would come to the talk. Don't turn the camera. So, let's go. The Bodleian Library is another example. Let me give you the final example, historically. This is in the 17th century. John Locke and Spinoza are in the 17th century. This is an age of reason, natural right, property. John Locke fights. In his theory of property, he does not mention intellectual property. I was very disappointed. I did a word search and doesn't mention it. But he fought for cheaper books when the copyright in Britain in the 17th century was a deal between the publishers, and the king. The king said, I will give you a monopoly. You can have the almanac, you can have the Bible, you can have children's books if you will censor the books and help me make sure that nobody says anything bad about me as the king. Now, Britain in the 17th century, they had cut the head off of Charles I. It was not a good time to be a king. You had to be very careful. It would be like in the United States, Homeland Security with the NSA. They were checking their smartphones. John Locke was, all his emails, everything was checked. Locke hated this. Everyone did. And they fought against it. But it was copyright. You had the right to copy every Bible and sell them. The authors had no business, and the copyright was based on censorship. And it meant for Locke that books were very expensive, and he worked against it. It took till the very end, to 1696, to get rid of that law. And in 1710, the first copyright, the first modern copyright, now I'm English speaking, anglais, and so I think that of course English has the first copyright law. We might want to argue about that in terms, but we consider it in the world the first copyright law. But I want you to listen to the title of the first Copyright Act. It's called the Statute of Anne, 1710. But its title is not How to Make Publishers Rich. The title is An Act for the Encouragement of Learning. The only basis, in a Lockean sense, we can justify making authors the privileged center of publishing and the right to copy is to encourage learning. And not only did it say that, now, to be honest, the publishers, they weren't publishers in those days, they were booksellers and they were printers. The booksellers and printers got behind learning because they were embarrassed. They had a century of censorship, and they had made a deal. They had gotten in bed with the king and made a deal to have that monopoly. They needed to clean their slate. They were feeling a little Augustan in their guilt. They had stolen many pears. And so they decided that they would get behind learning. But what they did is in the Act for the Encouragement of Learning, they guaranteed one copy of every book in the Cambridge University Library, in the Oxford University Library, in Edinburgh too, because there was now a state of union between Scotland and England. One book. Second, the head of the University of Oxford and Cambridge could charge publishers to lower their prices. This is such a lovely law. They could call the publisher and say, $30,000 for the journal Brain Research? I'm sorry. That won't do. How about $40.50? And he had the authority to do that. Another aspect in terms of how law set learning apart, and this is the key point, remember, that we want to say that intellectual property of learning is distinct. And an Act for the Encouragement of Learning said that. Another one that they said was the universities can run their own presses. The universities have a right to run a separate business and not compete with London, which owned publishing or printing in those days. They could import books. No one could restrict the importing of books to protect their monopoly. So if a good translation, and Locke used this example, that how is it that the Aeneid, that Virgil, who has been dead, let me guess now, so many years he will not profit anymore from the sale of his books, how can he be restricted in being imported into England? How can only how can only one person be allowed to print Virgil? And so there was now, the restriction was removed. And so this history that I've written actually stops here. because the history that I've written is a prehistory of intellectual property. And it tries to show that the intellectual property regime that holds today is preceded by centuries of work with intellectual property and learning. And that learning created a concept of intellectual property based on a right of access, not restriction, and that still remains to a certain extent. Let me show you some examples, give you some examples from today, and then I want to close with what I think the future holds. Examples from today. So we no longer have a right. The principal or the director of École Normale cannot ask Elsevier to drop their prices. He can barter. I'll give you 29,375 euros this year. And Elsevier will say 29,997 euros, my final offer. That's the power of the director here, because that law has been lost. Deposit, do you have to put one copy of every book in the National Library of France? Yes. Bodley rules, yes. The right of you as an author to the right of other people's work? Yes. It's been preserved. We call it fair use. In Canada, we call it fair dealing. In the United States, we call it fair use. That means, not Bob Dylan, but even Bob Dylan or Neil Young, if I am critical of it, if it's for purposes of review, if I want to review Leonard Cohen, he's getting a little old, and so am I, but his music is not as good when I was young and he was young. If I can write that and I can quote Leonard Cohen, that's called fair use. I cannot quote his whole song. I cannot quote it to put at the front of my book. Leonard loves my work. He wanted me to have this poem. I'd have to pay. But in review, in research, and in teaching, teaching's very interesting in America. I can teach Leonard Cohen once. The second time I teach Leonard Cohen, I have to start paying. If I have a brilliant idea and I'm talking, Suzanne takes you down to her place by the river, she feeds you tea and oranges all the way from China, I can do that. If tomorrow I come and I say to you, because that was spontaneous, and in America we want to be spontaneous. We want to be free. We want to be inspired. But if I'm routine, okay, I want everybody to read Leonard Cohen tonight in order to pass your exams, then we have to pay Leonard Cohen. So fair use is an exception. Fair use, another form of protection for learning, I don't know if this is true, and you have fair use, and there's a debate. In the English literature, we debate. If you look up fair use and France, you'll see things like, does France have fair use? Or you'll see titles like, yes, France does have fair use. That's okay. You protect the rights of authors better than we do. You have moral rights of authors. You cannot take an author's, even a sculpture, and tie ribbons on the sculpture, because that would be insulting, that would be hurting the moral rights of an author. In the United States, if you buy a work of art, you can dress it up. The authors no longer have that. Canada, we're starting to get some moral rights. Another exception is at the university, at Stanford University, I own my own intellectual property. At Google, my son owns no intellectual property. Everything he does for Google. Everything I do for you. I want to preserve your access rights. And so Stanford does not own my intellectual property. Patents, they do. They have a share in the patents. But even with patents, there is a special exception for learning in American law. If I do research in a lab and I use someone's patent, I do not have to, get a license. And so we have all of these exceptions, tax exemption, Stanford University is a private university, nonprofit, and it's a private university that depends on donors. I've worked only in public schools before I came to Stanford. I did not understand what this donor economy was like. It's a kind of aid, international aid sort of thing where you're always, I am the Kosala family chair, and the Kosala family, I had to phone them up and I had to tell them what I did. So it's a very odd economy, but all the money is tax exempt. And so we create another exception. If you remember the noble, the lord who wanted to create a monastery, he didn't pay any taxes, but he created that monastery by giving the land in order to create a credit with God. God was the tax collector in the medieval period. And when I gave land to a monastery, God would open his book and he would write down Willinsky gave, well, Willinsky probably not, but Farge, he would give a credit. And just like that, we do that at Stanford. We give them a tax exemption for donations. So there is in society today a recognition that learning is distinct, but there is not in publishing. In publishing, Elsevier owns the intellectual property. Wiley owns the intellectual property. The Association of Mathematicians own that intellectual property, and it creates the exclusion that we are fighting against in open access. So finally, let me conclude with where we need to head. The article processing charges, do you remember CEL, how much it cost? $5,000 for open access. The PLOS Biology is about $2,600. PLOS won the mega journal, 32,000 articles for which they got $1,350 each. Are you doing the math? 30,100, it's about $40 million PLOS made. This isn't going to work. Remember Simone Weil? She cannot get published in these journals. She does not have $3,000, $1,000. And so we need a new model. And what we're working on at the Public Knowledge Project and what we're trying to explore is the notion of a cooperative. The idea that libraries are buying this research. The libraries are spending about $10 billion a year, all worldwide. Not just here at the École Normale, no. At the United States, about $5 million a university. But $10 billion worldwide. The libraries need to take that $10 billion, that's 999,000 euros, 9.99 billion euros. They need to take that money and they need to say, we're going to form a cooperative partnership. We're going to give you the money to publish, but we're going to publish open access. And we are going to arrive at an agreement about what is a fair cost for an article. Because today we have this strange situation where CEL charges $5,000 for one article to be published open, and the history journals, in fact the 10,000 open access journals, the majority of them charge nothing. So how is it that a science journal that charges nothing and one charges $5,000? How is it that history journals have subscription rates in the area of $500 and brain research is $30,000? So we form a cooperative and the librarians take that $10 billion, not all at once, but take it and they say we need to rationalize how much it costs to publish. And we say that the ownership of this intellectual property is everyone. No one is to be excluded, whether they're in a public school, whether they're in a public library, whether they're in an internet cafe, whether they're at home, everyone has access. And with that $10 billion, we have enough money to arrive at an agreement with lots of debates and lots of discussions, because CEL will say, we need a lot of money. But they will have to justify that. And the historians will say, why do you need so much money? We've never had that kind of money. And they need to arrive at an agreement. And so the idea of the cooperation is to say, this learning needs to come out of the commercial market. This learning is a different kind of intellectual property historically and in the law today. And this learning is a public right. And whether it's, you want to call it natural law or natural right, as Spinoza and Locke did, whether you want to call it a human right, that everyone has access to this learning, we want to say that because it has been funded by the state, funded by private donors, because we have been trained at the expense of the state, but most importantly, because we cannot learn unless we have access. That was true for the monasteries. It was true for the West in terms of Islamic learning. It has been true for the library as a commons intellectually. And so unless we change this model, unless we find a way to create the commons in a way that is universally accessible and not just at very good schools like the École Normale and Stanford, then we really do not have a le droit d'auteur. We do not really have the rights of the author pinned down. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain questions.
You mentioned the idea of a cooperative for structuring the publishing, or
is it
cooperative of
cooperative, yes,
of journals.
Yes.
But it sounds like, you mentioned also public libraries as
yes.
an important body. So why not basically organize so that the libraries do the publishing?
Because we have an expertise. We have the editors and the scholarly societies have a very good system of peer review. So we need the cooperation of the editors, the scholarly societies, and the libraries. The libraries are very good at the technical infrastructure, so we will use the libraries for the servers and for the websites. The libraries are the librarians, we call them information scientists, and they will help with the indexing and the distribution. So it is that partnership that I think we need both sides. The libraries, and we have this discussion with librarians, and they're very clear, we're not publishers. We do not know about copy editing. We're not sure about peer review. You need to be an expert in the field to choose the right peers. So the partnership, yes. And we have some examples. Many libraries in America, and maybe here, I just was visiting with Open Edition, Marin Darcos in Marseille. He's working with the university to be a publisher, not a publisher, but to be a platform. And so Open Edition is a platform for different societies and journals to publish. And that would be a similar kind of model. In America, many libraries host on their websites journals to help them. And the journals are published for free. There's no charge from the library. And it's a kind of cooperation, a start. But still a small number.
May I take the privilege of a question
yes.
here? Because there is a point, it's not that I don't agree, but I need clarification.
Okay.
There is something I want to make clear. You have mentioned that peer reviewing, it's on the side of the publisher.
Yeah. Well,
I completely disagree. The peer reviewed by peer, I mean a scientist in activity like me, who is therefore not a publisher by definition. Publishers are not scientists in activity. Okay? And no, but this is a very important point, because publisher manipulate the politics, the politician, or the people who are not themselves in academic life, letting them think that publishers are in charge of peer reviewing.
Oh, no.
They manipulate it that way. I mean, and somewhere I wanted to clarify this kind of fuzziness in the.
Yes, fuzzy.
Yeah. And though the very important point, and because people in this room, you're academics, you know, but the average person in the street could not even imagine that we do all this extremely specialized work, highly, expert, because when you peer reviewed, you have to check for errors, you have to check for originality, which means you have to be yourself one of the few specialists of the topics of this paper under review. Though obviously only very professional, very specialized people, themselves scientists in activity. There are some exceptions on that, and we are called editors in the English sense. So in French, there is a confusion there because the French translation of editor, of course, is not editor. The French translation will be membre d'un comité de rédaction or something like that. And publisher, they are translated in French as editor, but to avoid this confusion, I always call them publisher in French too, because if not for academic life, it creates a really nasty confusion. Though let's go back. Normally, most of the journal, besides few exceptions, I'm going to give 2 examples. The editorial board, the editors, and the referee that are asked by the editors, they are scholars, specialists of this topic. There are 2 cases, some journals which have become famous, but unfortunately for me, they are not in the sense, peer, like Nature or Science, because their editors, they have editors, they have, Nature has about 100 of, more than 100, I may be wrong about the figure, I have to check. It's maybe even 1,000 for all Macmillan edition publishing. Anyway, the point is that they pay them, and they are themselves just people with some PhD, but who are no more in the academic life. They are just paid, hired by Nature for doing this, their role, you see. And as a result, this is a very different system from ours. The normal academic peer reviewing, the editors and the referee, we do that as part of our normal academic job, which means we don't ask for money for that. It just, though that's the point I wanted to clarify, because in a kind of pricing, looking at how much costs to do academic publication, we should put the price, in terms of pricing, the number of hours the scientists, no, but just for the pricing, we just need to compute how much time we spend for peer reviewing, as editor, as referee, and also the author, the time the author is writing the paper. All that is already paid on public money because it's part of the salary or the funding, the funding money that the academics have. Though it's the academic life, we want to keep peer reviewing that way, made by the peers on a kind of voluntary basis that we don't ask money for, but it should not be given then to the publisher, pretending that they are in charge of all that. And there is a very nasty moment that everyone in this room knows, but I have to make it clear. The moment where the publisher gets the intellectual property, it's the moment after peer reviewing when they ask the author, even by law, they ask only, the law is only asking one of the co-author, it's enough, to sign a copyright agreement, because it's in American law type, copyright type. You just sign a piece of paper, and then you give all intellectual property, the text, the figures, and the data printed, contained in the paper. And that's how then they can own that, and they own it for 70 years after the death of the last author. This is where there is where is the flow in the system, because they get this intellectual property. So the new system, first, scientists, we should not give that easily, and we should follow the trend of what you propose as open. Okay, yes, you have a micro. Yes, okay.
Maybe I can say something to raise the debate. Okay, just maybe on a provocative way. I think I have not been convinced by your comparison between middle age and now.
Okay.
And if I try to go back to what I heard or read, people like Giordano Bruno, Averroes, Spinoza, Maimonides didn't have an easy life for disseminating their work. That's for sure.
Yes.
So then I want to ask you, in the present situation, can you quote one complaint that was made by the publisher that brought scientists, academics, to a real trial, and what was, at the end of the day, the issue of such trial in terms of justice, law, repression, and so on?
But for doing what?
Well,
Why suing the
I mean, now it's still there is some kind of confrontation between the academic world and the publishers. And
yes.
I would like to know if someone has disseminated, as we do, we copy books, we give them to friends and so on.
Yes.
We don't
Or
follow
has
all
the publisher
rules.
sued?
Do you know anyone that had to face, in our community, that had to face
Yes.
a trial, a complaint,
Yes.
and that was convicted? Can you comment on
Yes,
that?
yes. Georgia State University. No, I have a microphone. I privilege. Georgia State University was taken to court by Cambridge University Press, by Springer, by the Publishers Association, for sharing their work publicly with their students. They put copies in the library electronically. Yes, and the courts have ruled first in favor, and the publishers appealed, and the most recent decision was against the university. So the publishers are prepared to take not students, not professors, but universities to court over their intellectual property rights. In terms of Marie's point, she's absolutely right. There is a confusion of terms because normally a publisher of fiction will have editors as part of the publisher. But in the academy, the editors are separate from the publisher. In medicine, the publishers are paid a complete and beautiful, wonderful salary, but only in medicine. So we have and then in scholarly societies, some scholarly societies are publishers. And so it is a confused area, but I could have been a lot clearer about that, because we are talking about the commercialization, not about the exclusion. So as long as the publishers are prepared to exclude, which they were trying to do with Georgia State University, we need a different model, I'm suggesting, in which the intellectual property belongs to a cooperative effort, globally, and on this principle. But I want to acknowledge that the publishers will not take a university professor to court. That would look very bad. They will not take an individual. So if you send out a PDF, you're okay. But that's illegal. And my position is, my position is that we shouldn't have to do it illegally. That we should, as it were, make this a public right, not just a workaround, as we would say.
Can I make?
No. And there's actually one over here too, after that.
Why is it so different in medical books? Is it because it's such a small diffusion, or is it because there are so many drawings and colors because of anatomy and physiology?
There are expenses involved, and certainly medical publishing has that tradition. But today, putting a beautiful illustration on the web does not cost any more than a black and white illustration on the web. And oh yes, and you need to prepare them.
And you can't invent it.
But the authors have never been paid for those inventions. Well, it gets complicated. Medical illustration is an art unto itself, and medical illustrators are professionals. And actually, let me deal with that. So medical illustrators would still be paid. The cooperative would say, we want better illustrations. And so therefore, we will, as a cooperative, take that $10 billion and we will pay, not for historians to have beautiful pictures. They need to get archival pictures from the National Archives. But we need a medical illustrator. We need a statistician to check the statistics. So I'm not saying the articles should be free. I'm not saying the copy editors should work for free. The graphic design. I want to see beautiful articles. I want to see the articles on the screen so I can read them. Those are not academics. They did not come through a public system. They would be covered through the cooperative by assigning money. But the same beautiful design would be used by the historians and philosophers who have no money as by the medical and biochemistry journals.
And just the issue of peer review.
Yes?
What about the quality? Usually they make... usually peer reviewing, I mean, it takes a lot of time, and they ask for correction to the author, and then back and forth, and so what happens with your 1 second system?
Yes, over here actually there's a question. So in that case we are not paid for peer review. We do this to contribute to the quality of learning, and we would still do that. So that would not change, and the author was never paid by the journal, and the author would never be paid, the author is paid by the journal by getting a promotion and by keeping their job and coming to the École Normale. And all of that would stay the same. We have always reviewed not to exclude people, but to help them improve their work. And that principle has been exploited, as Marie pointed out, by the publishers, and we would not change the peer review. And in fact, the cooperative could improve that peer review because they could design systems where the peer review continues after the publication. They could make sure that the societies have enough money to pick editors that are very good, to choose very good reviewers. So the quality would have to be paramount. We cannot take a reduction in quality. And primarily that's peer review. There's debate about whether peer review should be open, but not tonight.
That's a kind of charity from peer reviewing. It's some type of charity.
No charity. It's professional. It is, I'm already paid to do peer review. I'm already paid to teach and help others as a professor. This gentleman, yes.
When you talked about the need of a new model, I understand, but do you think that the open access is the solution to the newspaper crisis nowadays?
Yes and no. It is a contribution. The newspaper crisis in terms of journalism and what's happening to newspapers closing and the jobs of journalists, it will contribute insofar as the knowledge will be freely available to journalists. And journalists can become very, very good at interpreting the freely available research, of adding value to the freely available research. My whole project as a public knowledge project started in a partnership with the newspaper. They were going to do the journalism and interview teachers and students about computers in the schools, and I was going to provide the research to put the local schools in a global context, to take the teacher and give them some of the research that backs or criticizes or challenges their decisions. And so the partnership of scholarship and journalism, yes, this is Diderot. There is a tradition in which the scholar and the journalist work together, and we have excluded that. It will not save journalism. It will not answer every question. It will not, but it could make a contribution. It will make, the journalism will lead people, just like Wikipedia, to a more open learning, I would hope.
May I make a small comment about that?
Yes.
You know, the people who will most benefit, they are the entrepreneur or the companies, because, yes. I mean, like any industry or different companies, presently they cannot afford paying the publication, I mean, just a subscription cost.
Yes.
Though as soon as it's open, the society, en français on dit les sociétés commerciales,
yes, yes.
They will benefit probably the most, because we as academics, we pay the subscription,
yes,
very
yes.
high price, we are nearly broken with that, but we still do that. But a company, even a large one, I have talked to a very large company, they cannot afford the subscription, then they develop this kind of collaboration with a university in order to have access to the academic publication. No, but it makes sense to them.
Yes,
this
yes,
is the only way to get access. Though our own work is taken away from people who could apply it for, I mean, industrial applications, society benefit, and things like that.
No, that's a wonderful example. So we could imagine then small startups being able to use research. Our research would have greater public benefit. But this is all about that. Whether it's a student doing a science project, whether it's a small company using a new chemical process, this is about the increase in public benefit. Go back to the monastery moved away from the world in order to serve the world. When the convent didn't move away from the world, when the convent was in the city and was starting to traffic in things that weren't so good, it had no value, and they were closed down. The French Revolution played a role in that as well. But this idea then that we need to be apart from the world in order to serve the world. Because in America we have a threat where the universities are becoming incorporated. The universities are becoming businesses. They are seeking profit. They are starting companies. Stanford's a good example. And my argument is that if we do that, we will lose, we cannot compete, and we will lose our value. Because what is valuable about our work is what is distinct about our trade or craft, that original guild that the Université de Paris and others first created.
Some more questions?
The final question.
No, it's just an objection, sir.
Oh, okay.
You have sun in California, so the weather is so good. So
Very good, yes. We do have, as a Canadian, I'm now living without winter. Mon pays, c'est hiver. No more.
Another example where society will benefit a lot of open access. You know, people who got sick of some very special disease, they are the one who are then extremely willing to try to follow the scientific publication. There have been plenty of examples of like that, you know, like people with AIDS. They have developed a large group of people who become really specialists because they have AIDS, and then they collaborate with medical doctors.
Yes,
but in order to collaborate with medical doctors, they want to learn about AIDS themselves. And when you are yourself sick, you learn very fast, if you can see what I'm...
Yeah,
I
very
can
good
imagine that. So I think it's another example, and of course all the argument about pollution, about environment, it's much better that the people in the street, the consumer, if they feel really interested by an issue like that, they should have the chance to have access to the paper. They may not understand the paper, but at least they know what is a scientific paper, and then they will ask a scientist to explain. And we will create a dialogue which is not yet rich enough because they don't have access to our work. And the last kind of person will benefit a lot, and this is for me maybe the most important thing. Young people at school, maybe let's say 12, 13 years old, who have a passion for science, they should know what is science about. I mean, of course, they may not understand the paper, but they will know this is what is going on. That's what we want to do when we will be a scientist later on. And
so
it's another way to
increase their opportunities of coming to École Normale.
They have to know what scientists are doing. And it's already paid by taxpayer, though. I consider those at school, lycée, gymnasium, they should have contact.
I agree.
And they're also very curious. They will go to the web and try to read things. Well, I was doing that when I was a kid, but we were not having the web. Now they are very lucky to have the web. It's a big plus.
The young are so lucky. Listen, I want to thank everyone for coming out on a Friday evening. The night is still young, and I do hope you enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much for the chance to speak with you.